Hello, and welcome to the AAMFT podcast, your all-access pass to the latest news, developments, and thought leaders in the world of systemic therapy. We strive to relate, educate, and innovate, one episode at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Karam, and we're brought to you by the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Our podcast explores topics that relationship-based therapists care about. In addition to featuring unique conversations and interviews with established experts, our show provides information and education on direct practice and emerging trends in the MFT profession. For more information, please visit us at aamft.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to the AAMFT podcast. Dr. Eli Karam back with you, where we strive to relate, educate, and innovate one episode at a time. And we're going to talk about today one of the most requested topics, and that is mindfulness. Mindfulness has, in the last 2 decades, not only swept over psychotherapy in general, but also our niche of systemic thinking, couple and family therapy. And no better person to talk about that with us today than Dr. Diane Gehart. Diane is a jack of all trades. If you've ever gone to an AAMFT conference, you've probably seen her present. She's an author of one of the most widely adopted MFT textbooks, and she's just a great instructor and an innovator in the way we integrate concepts into the field of couple and family therapy. But one of those first questions is, well, what does that even mean? Mindfulness. I didn't have a class on that in graduate school. Or if I did, I wasn't really exposed to it. Well, for our purposes today, we'll define mindfulness as a meditation technique that's used to treat a number of mental health and physical conditions. And when practiced regularly, and Diane will talk about what that means, regular practice, it's a simple technique that can effectively reduce stress, depression, anxiety, and even chronic pain. It is something the more mature into my profession, I get the idea to be able to focus, to let all that negative stuff from one session kind of clear my head before I start the next session. That's professionally, but personally, in order to be present and aware and not distracted around the people I love the most. I mean, these mindful skills, we use them in work and out of work. So I think it's something that as you grow as a therapist, you can always improve on. And I'm very excited for Diane to talk about that today on the podcast. Diane Gehart is a professor of marriage and family therapy at Cal State University Northridge. She carefully tracks emerging research in our field and studied a wide range of therapeutic approaches, including mindfulness. As I said before, she's authored many influential texts, including Mastering Competencies in Family Therapy, and a book we'll reference today, Mindfulness and Acceptance in Couple and Family Therapy. Edition has been featured in newspapers, radio, TV, and is really an active leader in AAMFT. You can see her often presenting at conferences, and she's really taken the lead on the new simulation project within AAMFT that you've heard us reference on the podcast, and that she'll come back to speak on later in more depth. She's an approved supervisor and a clinical fellow of AAMFT. So we will be back and share some user-friendly resources after we talk to Diane. Today we're all here to talk about mindfulness and mindfulness in systemic therapies. But before we get there, I always like to ask our guests and experts how they got interested in the field of MFT to start with. So kind of tell me your origin story, if you will.
Oh, wow. It's a little lengthy, but it is fun, and it's a good marketing tool really for career counseling. So how I ended up in MFT, and it's actually intertwined with the whole topic of mindfulness. So I will start with, I grew up in Southern California, and I had visited the East Coast, and I ended up at William & Mary, College of William & Mary in Virginia. And I knew I wanted to do psychology from the quote unquote psychology from the day from high school, because I'd been a peer counselor back then. So I was sitting in this office with one of those real intimidating psych professors who, pure behavioralists, I call it rat science. We actually did science with rats there. And he's like, so Diane, choose an elective. And I'm like, I haven't looked at the catalog. He'd given me all the courses I need to be a psych major. You get one elective, pick it. I'm like, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? And I was panicked because he was not very warm or friendly. So I'm flipping through the catalog and I'm like, wow, they have a department of religion at a state school? That's amazing. I didn't know that was legal. And then I'm like, wow, they have a course in Buddhism. And so I ended up signing. He's like, well, that sounds fun. I'm signing up for Buddhism. There's space in that class. So I signed up for Buddhism. I ended up in this course, and it's an upper division course where everyone's already studied Japanese and Chinese. I'm the only one who doesn't know an Asian language in the course. I do get a B in Buddhism, and that's part of my, just kind of my fair warning when I get into the mindfulness. But I fell in love with Buddhism. So I ended up actually being a psychology and East Asian Studies major. Both of those were majors, and I did eventually learn Chinese. And I ended up selecting my first doctoral program that I started but did not finish was in Asian studies, and I was planning to be a Tibetan Buddhist scholar. And so that was my first. And then when I got there and I was studying Tibetan, I realized that like the TAs had PhD after their name. I'm like, that's weird. I thought you get to be the professor when you have PhD. So I started talking to people, and like, yeah, most of the people end up working for the CIA. And I'm like, wow, I am so not CIA material. I mean, Indiana Jones was big. I'm like, I would be dead in the first 24 hours. So I'm like, let me go back to psychology. So, and as it happens in life, I did that at the University of Washington. I was dating someone from Texas. So I ended up going back to Texas and applying to schools there. And I applied to a program, and there were two boxes. Do you want to specialize in community mental health or MFT? And it was actually a counseling program. I had no idea. I wasn't signing up to be in a psych program. I'm like, wow, that family I moved 3,000 miles away from when I was, going to undergraduate, I think family therapy would be really interesting. So I signed up for it. I have no idea actually what I'm signing up for. But I sit in my first systemic theories course. And as they're describing these theories, I'm like, oh my goodness, this is Taoism and Buddhism put to practical use.
It's like putting a language to a way you've always thought but didn't have the systemic language to go with.
Exactly. And so the holistic thinking is very much part of the Taoism that I'd been studying, and the deconstructionist philosophies of social constructionism. And I'll be honest, this was 1992 and 3 when postmodernism was barely in a textbook. But I'm like, this is it. I am going to be a Tibetan Buddhist scholar, but I'm going to do it in a practical way and study these ideas. And I fell in love. I'm still in love. I love these ideas. They excite me, and that's how I ended up being an MFT. It was, it's a good advertisement for career counseling. I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but once I realized what it was, I have just loved it.
If our listeners don't know what mindfulness is, they've heard it, but as you said, it's not in traditional MFT text, or at least many of the text. How would you define that for the layman, if you will, define mindfulness?
So, and there are a lot of misconceptions about mindfulness. So mindfulness is a very specific form of practice. It often takes the form of a meditation, but it's when you consciously choose, and that's very important, you consciously choose to focus on something in the present moment. It can be your breath. If you're doing body meditation, body scan, it's, experiencing what your body feels like. You can do an eating meditation. So something in the present moment, and trying to quiet the inner chatter in your mind. It never totally goes away. But you try to quiet your mind and just experience what's going on without using language to describe it. And what happens is, though, that doesn't last for more than a few seconds. And so you must constantly refocus. And when you refocus, you do it with compassion and non-judgment. So those are the critical elements. And, I think it's important to distinguish it from like flow, because flow is a very similar, my students will say, well, when I'm running, I'm meditating. I'm like, Now, when you're running, you experience flow, which is a natural byproduct of an activity that takes effort. But so you put effort into running, but the flow mental state, the state of flow, is not anything you control and doesn't require like discipline on your part. Where mindfulness requires discipline, you are consciously refocusing your mind and trying to quiet the inner chatter that's always there.
So flow comes when you're engaged in something else, where mindfulness is a purposeful, directed activity all of it of itself.
Yes, exactly. And flow is always joyful. Mindfulness is not. and flow is important too. We should all, engage in activities regularly that, give us that natural byproduct. But mindfulness really is a different practice, and it does take effort. And it's, you don't always have that joyfulness that is associated with flow.
Okay, so when you got into the field, again, while you told your origin story, and it's a beautiful fit for what you were interested in, but when you entered, nobody was integrating this into psychotherapy, much less systemic psychotherapy, what we know as of couple and family therapy. So talk about how you took your interest and then started to integrate it into the training of MFTs. You're known as kind of an innovator in training. And again, this is something that you're passionate about, but it didn't exist when you entered the field. So talk about how you kind of then developed into training other systemic-based therapists.
Yeah, and when I first entered the field, I remember being terrified to mention that meditation, Buddhist psychology, anything like that. Like, I literally, especially during my doctoral program, I kept it really quiet. And but I do remember my first breakout was during my doctoral comps in terms of how I develop therapeutic relationships. But at some point, I think before I even graduated, I was like, God, what I gotta have professional presentations and publications to be a professor. What should I do? And one of the areas where I started working was actually, talking about how Buddhist psychology aligns with could inform systemic practice. And so that was some of my earliest presentations were on this topic. So I was presenting up in Canada, actually, on Buddhist psychology and how it could inform family therapy and mental health generally. And this was in the early 90s. And someone during the conference came up to me and they're like, "Have you heard of Jon Kabat-Zinn?" And I'll be honest, I had not. I felt really embarrassed afterwards. But that's when I learned, because at that point I had used the term Buddhist psychology. At that point I could do a literature review and there were 6 articles in the field. There was a day where you could do exhaustive literature reviews. And so then I put mindfulness, and then I got 20 hits. But so early on I learned that mindfulness is really how these ideas were being introduced to the field. And Jon Kabat-Zinn work really separated out any religious aspects from the actual practice of mindfulness. So that is, and then once the mindfulness, and I realized this is how this is going to be introduced to the field of mental health.
I think a lot of our listeners, they're intrigued by this, but they want you're such a good storyteller, they want an idea of what this would look like. So if I'm someone, it's much like we like to think, if you don't understand the concept and how it works for you, it's very hard to teach clients, an individual, much less a couple or a family, how to do this. So how do you start introducing this to students and training them to be mindful themselves before they can teach this to their clients?
Exactly, yeah, and that is a very important point, because the general recommendation is 6 to 12 months of personal practice on the part of the clinician before you try to introduce this to clients. And I worked with my colleague Eric McCullum, who had done a lot of research in multi-couple groups related to domestic violence with Sandra Stith. But I randomly bumped into him at a solution-focused conference, and at the time he was I was presenting on mindfulness and Buddhism. He was sitting in the audience, and at the end he stayed there, and he was like, "So, I have some interest in this too." So the two of us started working together, and we actually presented at conferences for over a decade on mindfulness together, and we decided that it would be really good for our students to learn how to to practice mindfulness to help them manage their anxiety, to work on their therapeutic presence in the room. And so he and I worked together. I think we started in 2004. We both got permission from our deans and chairs to integrate mindfulness into our fieldwork curricula. And so the basic requirement we decided that was realistic was having our students practice 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week. Just because the discipline required is quite significant. And doing 5 minutes of mindfulness a day, 5 days a week is a lifestyle change. It radically changes your every aspect. And it's because it takes so much work to slow down from most of our hectic paces of life to do that 5 minutes. And there's a wonderful video that's associated with my book, Mastering Competencies in Family Therapy, and it's available if you get the Mind Tap online edition. And I just love this video because I have a teenager who's got diagnosed with ADHD, wants to learn mindfulness, and I work with him. It's demonstrating cognitive behavioral family therapy because mindfulness is associated with behavioral approaches, and we sit there for like 20-30 minutes figuring out how he's going to do 5 minutes of mindfulness before school, and it really does require him to go to bed half an hour early. And it's just a beautiful illustration, like that's the reality. So we knew we were asking our students to do a lot. We also introduced, there are Christian forms of mindfulness called contemplative prayer. There are Jewish-based versions of mindfulness, so we also allowed people to kind of integrate this with their own personal existing spiritual practices. But we had our students do that, and we really, I think both of us were blown away by...
What was the buy-in like, or did you get any resistance from certain students, even though 5 minutes, as you said, doesn't seem like that long? It's very purposeful, and it's a systemic lifestyle change when you start doing that. What was the resistance, if any, that you got from students?
And so this is 2004, and Eric is at Virginia Tech, outside, the DC area, one of the satellite campuses for Virginia Tech, and I'm in California and Los Angeles area. So my students they were cool with it. It's California, meditation's just part of the culture, and so my students actually begged me to require it the second semester of field work because they wouldn't do it unless they had to, but they knew it was good for them. So in LA, I had very little resistance. In Virginia, Eric had to work a bit harder. There were some students who were uncomfortable with it because it was an Eastern spiritual, we use the term mindfulness, it does refer to an Eastern religious practice, but there are definitely, Judeo-Christian versions of this as well. But he certainly struggled more with the resistance than I did. But I think we did some qualitative research, a little bit of quantitative kind of outcome stuff, and it was stunning. And just as a professor, as a supervisor, I can say that mindfulness was only second to live supervision in helping students in their first year become clinicians. Because if you can manage your stress response, as a new clinician, you have access to everything you've learned in the first year or so of the program.
To me, that's the buy-in right there, is even if you are a student who is skeptical, if the buy-in is this will help me be a better therapist, this will help me clear my head, limit my anxieties, be able to be fully present and focus on my clinical development and my work with clients. To me, that is the buy-in.
Absolutely. And one of the things I use a lot of Dan Siegel, who just describes some of the neurobiology of mindfulness. And I'm gonna see if we can do this in a podcast. But if everyone who's listening, unless your hand is on the steering wheel, I recommend if you pick up your hand and fold your thumb down and then put your knuckles over your thumb. What you have is what Dan Siegel calls a handy model of the brain, with your brainstem represented by your wrist. So that's what keeps your heart beating and your lungs going without you consciously saying, heartbeat, time to breathe, lungs. That's totally, so we have no conscious control over this part of the brain. The thumb represents your limbic system, which is where the stress response, the fight, flight, or freeze response is. And then your prefrontal cortex is represented by your knuckles in the very front, which is where good decision-making, executive functioning, And all that good stuff you learned in grad school is located in that prefrontal cortex. And what happens is if when you become stressed, and this is supervisors who do live supervision, we just watch this happen. As you become stressed, you quote unquote flip your lid. So that would mean lifting your fingers off that thumb, and you flip your lid, which means, and your prefrontal cortex goes offline under stress. And the reason for this is biological, because if a bear is about to eat you and you've got to either run, fight, or freeze, praying that the bear doesn't see you, your prefrontal cortex it's too slow. You're not going to save your life. So that's how our brains are just wired. Unfortunately, our brains are not wired to be nervous as a first-year MFT student. So what happens is all the academic knowledge they have, you don't have access to it. And so that is why if you can keep your lid on, so to speak, in your first year of therapy, that changes the game. Because I remember as a new supervisor, I'd watch some of my best students go into session. They'd come out, they'd have mid-session break, and I'd be like, go in and ask, a scaling question. I'd give them the words, right? They'd go back into the room, and they wouldn't do it. And I'm like, what's going on here, folks? And what it was is that they were so stressed, their lid was so flipped, they didn't have access. They literally could not remember what I had just told them. And that's why the stress response, when it's totally normal and natural to be stressed out. If you're not stressed as a first year MFT, I would be concerned. But if you can keep your lid on, even, improve that 50%, your first year is going to go so much more smoother, and you'll be a much better therapist in that first year.
Formats, if we'll have students, we'll have educators, really anyone interested in systemic-based relational therapies listening to this podcast. If I'm an educator, where does this fit in a MFT curriculum? Do you do it in supervision? Should it be in a pre-practicum or skills course? Where should it fit both course-wise and in the 2 to 3 year training sequence of most of our MFT students?
Well, ideally, the ideal place for it would be in the pre-practicum because you do rewire your brain. If you practice 5 minutes a day, 5 days a week, every time you refocus during the mindfulness meditation, the basic, what we have most people do is try to focus on your breath, quiet the inner chatter. When your mind wanders, return it without being judgmental or compassionate or telling yourself that, oh my God, I'm a horrible meditator, and beat yourself up, which is what most of us do. So if you do that, every time you refocus, you have a new type of neural firing between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. And so you literally thicken the connection and increase your ability to shut down that stress response consciously. And so if you can do that in the first year, then by the time they're in field work, the students will neurologically, their brains will have an increased capacity to focus and calm their limbic system under stress. So the earlier the better. But again, field work is nice because there's more motivation. The motivation's higher to practice in field work because they're experiencing their stress. It is overwhelming, and anything to shut that down. So I feel theoretically that first semester would be the best, but it's certainly the motivation is higher, and that's once they start seeing clients.
And what I love about this, I love anything that will make me a better therapist. And even 2 decades into practicing and being an educator, this skill is something, as long as you keep practicing, you could always get better at it. You don't peak. You can always be more mindful. So I love anything, as I said, that will make me a better therapist. So if I'm listening to this and I wasn't lucky enough to have Diane or Eric in graduate school and I'm out there practicing, this framework fits with any preferred orientation, any of your preferred model or theory. It's one of those things that enhances your therapist factors, so to speak. So if I'm out in the field, out a graduate student, already practicing, how can I improve my mindfulness? Where can I get trained in this, Diane?
So I do recommend that you find an 8-week mindfulness-based group that's affiliated, especially since we're professionals. On the East Coast, you're going to find a lot of mindfulness-based stress reduction, and you can Google mindfulness-based stress reduction at the University of Massachusetts, and find a list of all of their approved teachers. They do have a very rigorous training program, and getting into one of those 8-week MBSR courses. Another set of courses to look at is mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is based on the mindfulness-based stress reduction, but has a specific emphasis on depression and anxiety. It is the gold standard for depression relapse. And so that's a mindfulness-based cognitive therapy to find, someone who's trained in that. And then on the West Coast, UCLA is kind of our headquarters, where it's the mindfulness awareness program at UCLA. And let's see, I think that's Mark. It's under that one I have memorized because I live in LA. It's marc.ucla.edu, but it's the Mindfulness Awareness Research Center at UCLA, which also has, similar to these other programs, these 8-week standardized programs where they're very rigorous training for the instructors who do a good job. What happens in those 8-week courses is that you get integrated into the practice and all of its subtleties. And being in a group, I have had students, there's an online version I know of the UCLA program, and my students have said that the face-to-face, you really do get more out of it. But just knowing that there's a group of 10 to 30 other people going home, sitting in an empty room by themselves, doing this totally boring practice by themselves helps motivate you. And then coming back and talking about the experience, because what you're really doing is you're observing the mind in action. And I think this is so important for anyone who works in the mental health field, to observe what the mind actually is like, because it's humbling. It is humbling, and it should be humbling. But understanding that helps you develop a lot more compassion and just understanding of the subtleties of how the mind works. But that, having those conversations, there's nothing that replaces that. Having those conversations and dialogues that happen in those 8-week mindfulness classes, so that you really, and to understand how to deal with, I don't have time to practice mindfulness. And, what happens if I sit down for 5-10 minutes and I can't focus the entire time, my mind's wandering? How do you deal with that? Or how do you deal with all the different struggles? And there are a lot of struggles that come up in this practice. And so those groups are very helpful. And that allows you, especially because you're not going to experience all the forms of resistance and struggle that a human can have. And if you're going to go teach this to other people, sitting in a group of 10 to 30 other people, listening to all the different ways that people can struggle, this will allow you to actually help clients.
I love it, because we're relation-based people anyway, so the experiential component, not only processing with other people that are learning it for the first time, but even if you don't have a block, there's a good chance when you're teaching this to clients, they will. So hearing other people's experience or what blocks them from getting to this more mindful state is something that will help you when you're delivering it and teaching it to your clients.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Okay, now here's one I think of a lot. So this seems like something that is inherently, it's hard to put an argument against it, why you wouldn't want to be more mindful and train it. But when we try to make it systemic, what does this look like? I think everybody can kind of visualize what it would look like in individual therapy. What does this look like when you're working with multiple people in the room? Maybe you have a good example of teaching mindfulness as it pertains to couple dynamics or family dynamics, maybe two parents and a out-of-control teenager or what have you. How does it work systemically?
Well, it actually works best, better systemically than with individuals. I can tell you that because I've been doing this for a long time. So the best way to learn the practice of mindfulness is in an 8-week standardized group. The second best way is in couple or family therapy. The hardest way to do it is individual therapy, because there's just, we don't have a social discourse that puts a lot of value on sitting around doing nothing in a room by yourself. And so it's the first thing everyone cuts off their to-do list, unless there is social pressure, which is why I think the social setting makes a big difference. And in terms of working with couples and families, the place that I have had the most success is really working with families where a child has been diagnosed with ADHD. Because mindfulness is one of only 2 evidence-based approaches that have the potential to actually correct some of the underlying, neurobiology of ADHD, and if you think about it, mindfulness is practicing focus. Okay, so however you use your brain, right? The neurons that fire together wire together. So as you practice focusing using mindfulness, you do subtly shift the structures of the brain to increase the capacity of the prefrontal cortex to shut off the limbic system. The ADHD is basically, the prefrontal cortex isn't fully online. That's why we give people stimulants to wake it up. And so, but mindfulness actually increases the capacity of a person to focus. So, in many parents, and quite frankly, the key to mindfulness practice being regular is motivation. It really is not how to do it, but how do you motivate yourself or your clients to do it? That's the struggle. And so with families who have kids diagnosed with ADHD, because there is a sufficient amount of evidence that's quite motivating that these pretty intense medications, that is the motivation that I've been the most successful with families with kids or adults diagnosed with ADHD to get off those meds. So basically the basic idea is to find a time where the family can work, sit down and practice the mindfulness and find a way for that to work. And when you're working with couples, the issue that typically comes up is always one person is going to be more motivated than the other, and you just need to make sure that it's not such a high conflict couple where this becomes another thing they argue about, more evidence that so-and-so is, not doing his or her part or is lazy or whatever. So with couples, you just have to, I think they need to be out of the high conflict stage for this to work with them. You just have to navigate. And even with the kids, I don't want the parents, you got a kid diagnosed with ADHD, right? So the parents are probably nagging that kid a lot. So I really work on having the kid, I put, if they have a digital device, I have them put reminders on their phone to have the kid ask the parent to sit down and do mindfulness rather than it having something else the parent nags the child about. Obviously, age plays into this, but once the kids are, 9, 10, I try to get them to be the one nagging the parent to do mindfulness.
Those are great examples. I use one with couples. Many couples therapists teach couples how to take time out and what you should do and what you should not do during a time out. I think teaching mindfulness and a partner that can go and practice the focus and clear their head, as many couples want to come back and restart that dialogue before they're completely calmed down or reset. So practicing the mindful techniques really helps shorten that refractory period so you can restart a conversation in a productive way. But you're right, it's hard to imagine teaching someone to do that in the midst of a high conflict. You mentioned, two great ways, an experiential group. You talk about this kind of online delivery. You're very humble, but talk about your book. One of the best things, as I said, about people that have read your text, and I'm talking specifically about your mindfulness book, is that you do have very clear examples, much like you gave us the example of the fist to represent the brain. Just very good examples of what this would look like. If somebody picks up your book, what will they find in there, Diane?
Oh, my book, Mindfulness and Acceptance in Couple and Family Therapy?
Yes.
So this is a book that I wrote to kind of put all these ideas together. And I do actually, because part of how I got into this whole profession was looking at the Buddhist psychology and comparing it to systemic and postmodern ideas. So I have a lot of fun doing that. And then I really think of it as there are two different ways to work with mindfulness and the related concept of acceptance, which is when, if you think of the mindfulness practice, when you refocus, the idea is to not judge what yourself or your thought that you just had, and to do so with compassion. And so that's the acceptance piece. So one part, I talk about how to teach couples and families, kind of like we've been discussing here, how to actually meditate, like do mindfulness meditation at home. And I should add to that, there are a lot of fabulous apps with out there, like Insight Timer, that come with lots of free guided meditations, as well as a bell that you can program any way you want to, micromanage that bell. And there's also Headspace is the one that many of my especially adolescents when I have them do this, really like Headspace. It does it step by step. But the other half of the book talks about not how to get people to meditate, because there's so many. Meditation is a major lifestyle change. Actually getting someone to practice 5 minutes a day is a huge thing to ask. And that's why I think it's so important that people have a 6 to 12 month practice beforehand, and you realize the enormity of that request. And you can see people who have not been well trained. They're like, oh yeah, practice 20 minutes a day. And they get this, their client who has anxiety. And I'm like, you almost need to not have a job to do 20 minutes a day, or at least no kids, no major outside commitments, and a job that's only 40 hours a week. So that's one piece. But the other half of the book, and I think actually the majority of the book, really looks at how do you use these concepts to inform whatever approach to therapy and counseling that you might be using. And I think one of the concepts in terms of acceptance and Buddhist psychology that really shifted how I work, which I describe in this book, is this concept of equanimity is really the goal. And if you think of certain approaches where it's like, if you think of solution focus comes to mind, where you come in, the client gets to state what their goal is, and I'm going to work with you to achieve that. And there isn't a lot of space in some of these approaches to really reflect on, is that a realistic goal? Is that a goal that, is that the best way to conceptualize our goal? And the concept of equanimity is that our goal is not to get happy or have conflict-free relationships, or to have just ongoing perfect happiness, and every time we're not happy, that's a problem. The goal is to develop what the Buddhists call a sense of equanimity, which is to move with the ups and downs of life gracefully. And that really shifted how I see my work. My work is to really, and you can maybe call it resilience, it relates to a lot of the resilience work. My goal is to help whoever comes to me not only work through whatever problem they're currently working on, but to help them to realize that, life has its ups, it has its downs, and how do you move through that gracefully? And so that is one of the real gifts, I think, of the Buddhist psychology to mental health. Because if we almost subtly promise our clients, it's not a direct, money-back guarantee, but there's this implication in the field of mental health that if you're unhappy or experiencing problems, something must be wrong. And that is a very dangerous concept, because I don't know anyone who is able to go through this life and not have challenges. And so this is where I think Buddhism, the Buddhist psychology, really challenges us, and I think it's something a challenge we need to take seriously, and that we can do our work much better in terms of helping our clients learn, before they're done with us, how to develop more equanimity.
I mean, you've been interested in this for a long time now, and have again pioneered the integrating of this into couple and family therapy practice and training. Where are we headed, let's say, in the next decade? Where would you like mindfulness to be as far as integrating into our field, looking into the future?
I definitely think it should be an important part of our clinical training. It doesn't, have to be mindfulness, but I think understanding the stress response, how it affects any of us in the field, and how that relates to the trauma and trauma response, I think is really important. But I think increasing the capacity of therapists to manage their stress response is essential. And I should also mention that mindfulness is very important in working with traumatized clients, which is definitely the majority of anyone who comes into our room has a history of some kind of trauma. And one of the things they have found is that trauma neurologically is your brain is not in an integrated neural state, and often, depending on the severity of the trauma, it can't get back into that. And mindfulness physiologically helps people get into that integrated neural states. And clients with significant trauma histories, what they're finding is that what actually happens is the therapist has to be in an integrated neural state to really work through trauma with clients. Because what happens is, because brain waves actually kind of link up and they get into they kind of fall in sync, and it's what's called what Dan Siegel calls attunement. They get into a relational attunement, and you know how you feel felt by either your partner or your friends or a good therapist. You feel connected. They can measure that now with the brain, but therapists need to get into that neural state and allowing their clients and get into attunement with their clients. The clients actually borrow the therapist's integrated neural coherent brain state to put all the pieces of the trauma together to in order to resolve the trauma. Because in some ways,
gives new meaning to the term, kind of internalizing your therapist if you're the client, literally being in sync with them, intuit them.
Yes, yeah, and neurologically, you can define. Effective. The resolution of trauma is all those scattered memories that happen when your hippocampus goes offline. It's like the video recorder of your mind goes offline during the trauma because you're so overwhelmed. Those, sights, sounds, memories, those are all scattered throughout your brain. And so the, resolution of trauma is putting it all into a coherent narrative, which didn't happen. Because the brain was focused on survival, and you put it into this coherent narrative, and that's why the flashbacks and the nightmares, and the hypervigilance ends. So, but a therapist has to be in an integrated neural state. I don't think trauma treatment will ever be online. That one we get to keep doing face to face. So I think this is essential for therapists to really understand the mind. And so in terms of the future, I think really working with our students in some way, doesn't have to be sitting down, watching yourself breathe quietly, but to find ways for therapists to be able to ensure that they're in an integrated neural state. And that was really a new concept for me, that the neural state of my brain impacts the quality of what I do in the room. And that's a new level of responsibility in some ways. It's like I always find, at least, even if I'm running late, I take 60 seconds to get myself into, a good neural state when I do therapy so that I can be present, my clients can feel felt, and the work's going to just be more effective.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up too, because that's what I do too, kind of my ritual. If I have a 50-minute hour, I have 10 minutes to write a note, go to the bathroom, return a call, and I save a minute or two through this advanced practice to clear the mind, no matter how difficult the last session was, and to focus on the session to come. So it really becomes a practical skill for the therapist. You're so authentic and such a good storyteller. We'll end with one question. Talk about how, because you've been practicing this for a long time, and I think some people are like, well, I can never get to that level. I can never do it the way Diane does it. Talk about how your own practice has made you. We've talked about how it makes you a better therapist. Talk about how it makes you a better spouse, a better mother, a better friend. Give a personal story, really how your practice of this directed mindfulness has made you a better person.
I say that I literally have on my to-do list every day is an automatic reminder to do mindfulness and I try to do it.
You do it the same time every day?
I try to do it after I get dressed, yes, in the morning, and before I walk downstairs to get in the car and drive to work. I try to do it at the same time every day. I'm worse at doing it at night because sometimes I'm like too tired, and so I want that kind of focus at the beginning of the day. So I'm a morning meditator, but if I forget when I get to work, like because I was rushed, there's my computer just whacks me in the face and says, did you, do your meditation? I get these little reminders. So it's not like I do this and I put it in the category of flossing. It's like, because, if you sit there and wait for the mood to strike you, like, oh, it's a spa experience, and, I'm just in this big spiritual moment. It's like, if you wait to get into that mood, you'll never meditate. And so I'm like, you have to do it to take care of your brain. I hate flossing my teeth. I do it every day anyway. And that's really where I put mindfulness. It's like, you've got a brain. You need to maintain it. You're going to meditate even when it's totally inconvenient and you don't feel like doing it. Yeah, because I'm a busy mom. I've got 2 young kids, sort of got 3 different jobs. So I rarely feel like meditating unless it's vacation, where it I feel like doing it. This would just be a beautiful moment. So it is a discipline for me. And I think where I used it most importantly, really, when I was a new mother. And my babies would cry, as babies do. And anyone who has kids, maybe they experience this, like the stress response that goes off in a sleep-deprived mother's brain is really off the charts when your baby starts to cry. It's like, oh my God, no sleep. Oh my God, what's wrong? And my stress response would go off because you're sleep deprived, you're exhausted, you've got this baby. And I remember saying, Diane, you have to pick up that baby in an integrated neural, state. So take 3 deep breaths. The baby can cry for 10 more seconds. And she put your smart part on, which is what I call it when I teach mindfulness to kids, your prefrontal cortex. Get yourself into an integrated neural state, because when you pick up that baby and you're calm and you're at peace, the baby's going to calm down sooner and you'll get back to sleep. So you'll get to go back to bed. And that is really, and it really was very important, I think, in those early years of parenting for me that I remember quite distinctly. So that was one of the gifts. And I cannot imagine having a newborn without meditating on a regular basis, because that is what got me through.
Thank you so much for sharing both your professional wisdom and that personal story. And it's been great to have you on the podcast. We will have you on later in the year to talk about some other exciting things. Tracy Todd mentioned in our debut episode everything you're doing with simulation and MFT training. So that's a whole different line of interest, but will interest our listeners. But we'll have you back later for that. Thank you so much, Diane, for all that you do for the profession and for being with us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Eli.
I don't know about you. Whenever I go to a workshop or listen to a podcast, I always like to walk away with some skill that I can integrate either into my life or usually into my therapeutic life as a MFT. And whenever I talk to Diane, whether it be in a professional setting or watching her speak or listening to her, I always pull away something. So I'm hoping you got some tips in there. For those of you that already knew about mindfulness, but maybe for some of our listeners that didn't, now have a good place to start and a framework which to move forward. So if you want to move forward, I can give you a couple of hints and tell you about some things. For all things Diane Gehart related, you go to dianegehart.com. Very simple. www.dianegehart.com. There you'll find out about everything in her career as far as resources for professionals, clients, including all of her current publications. In fact, if you go into the resources tab, you will find a special section all around mindfulness, where she has a mindfulness quick start guide, her approach to mindfulness, and some recommended reading. Speaking of recommended reading, coming out very soon, September 2019, is Diane's book for the general public, incorporating a lot of these ideas she told us about today. It's called Mindfulness for Chocolate Lovers. And in this book, Diane combines wit, wisdom, and a touch of sweetness, as you can tell she has, to help you uncover playful ways to transform any aspect of your life. So this is a thing meant to share with your clients. You can enjoy it yourself, but it's really meant for the general public. Look for Diane on YouTube. She has been very generous in giving away kind of her tips and her skills, whether it be reviewing models or preparing for a licensure exam. But as for our topic today, all you need to do is go to your YouTube browser and type in Diane Gehart and mindfulness, and you're going to see very informative, short 3 to 5 minute videos, things like instructions for starting mindful practice, mindfulness in schools, mindfulness for children, and there is a 23-minute video that's really great that is how to meditate. And this would work for you as you're starting your own journey into mindfulness. It would certainly work also to be able to help a client figure out how to get into this mindful meditative space. All of those free and easy on the Diane Gehart YouTube channel. If you want to find us, it's quite simple. You can find the AAMFT podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Mine is Apple Podcast, also Spotify, Google Play, whatever have you. And there you'll see our backlog of all of our past installments from our 2019 journey into podcasting at the AAMFT. As always, to keep up with the AAMFT, go to aamft.org, send us an email. We'd love to hear feedback about the show. Best way to do that is communications@aamft.org. Also, follow the conversation on Twitter. The handle is @the AMFT, and I'm @Dr. Eli Live. I love being a part of the AMFT, and I love interacting with other MFTs and the listeners of this podcast. Please drop us a line. Until next time, stay systemic, my friends.